Types of sentences. Before we talk about sentences, let's talk about types of clauses, because it requires at least one clause to make a sentence. There are two types of clauses. Independent clause. An independent clause, or IC, is a subject and a verb. Contains at least one subject and one verb. For example, he enjoys traveling. He is the subject, enjoys is the verb. The dependent clause, or DC, has at least one subordinator and at least one independent clause, or subject and the verb. For example, because he enjoys traveling. In order to make a sentence, you should use at least one independent clause with a period at the end. You cannot make a sentence with only one dependent clause. The first type of sentences is a simple sentence. A simple sentence contains at least one independent clause, one IC with a period, or subject and verb with a period. For example, I work every day. In this sentence, we have only one independent clause with one subject and one verb, I work. The second example shows you a compound subject. My sister and I work every day. Even though you have two subjects, it's still one independent clause, SSV. The third example has two verbs, I work and study every day. The formula is SVV. Even though there are two verbs, it's still only one independent clause. And the final exam has two subjects and two verbs. My sister and I work and study every day. Despite two subjects and two verbs, it's still only one independent clause, therefore a simple sentence. Let's have a look at some more examples. It was cold yesterday. The subject, it, verb, was. We have one subject in the verb unit. It's a simple sentence, one independent clause. My friend and I are looking for a job. We have my friend and I, two subjects, and one verb, are looking. Even though we have two subjects, these two subjects only share one verb. It's only one unit of subject in the verb. It's only one independent clause. The boys won't have to give their names in court, will be driven to the hearing in unmarked vehicles, and will be allowed to come into court through a private entrance. It's a very long sentence, and it does not look like a simple sentence at all. However, if you look at the subject, if you find the subject, the subject is the boys, and if you start looking for more subjects, there are no more subjects, but there are three verbs, and all these three verbs won't have, will be driven, will be allowed, belong to one subject, the boys. We have one subject and three verbs. SVV, it's only one unit of the subject and the verb. It's only one independent clause, so it's a simple sentence. A compound sentence contains at least two independent clauses, two ICs, or two units of subject and the verb. For example, my friend works and I study. We have two independent clauses. The first independent clause contains one subject and one verb, my friend works. And the second independent clause is I study, one subject I and verb study. The birds are singing, the sun is shining, and the flowers are blooming. We have three units of subject and the verb, or three independent clauses. The birds are singing, one independent clause. The sun is shining, the second independent clause. The flowers are blooming, the third independent clause. Writing a compound sentence involves the right punctuation. Rule number 1, Fanboys. You connect two ICs with a comma and fanboys in between. Fanboys stands for F for A and, N, nor, B, but, O, or, Y, yet, S, so. For example, I enjoy reading, but I don't like writing. We have two independent clauses, I enjoy and I do not like. We connected two ICs with a comma and Fanboys but. She enjoys reading, but she doesn't have time to read. Two ICs are connected with a comma and Fanboys but. I have to take a nap, for I'm very tired. We have two ICs, I have and I am, two units of subject and the verb, and we connected two ICs with a comma and Fanboys for. For means the same as because. The birds are singing, the sun is shining, and the flowers are blooming. Now we have three independent clauses, and we connect three independent clauses as follows. I see, comma, I see, comma, and then one of the Fanboys, in this case, and, I see, period. Rule number 2. You can connect two independent clauses with just a semicolon. For example, I enjoy reading, semicolon, I do not like writing. The birds are singing, semicolon, the sun is shining, semicolon, the flowers are blooming. That's not recommended to use this punctuation all the time because it becomes kind of a dry sentence. It's always good to use either transitions or Fanboys. But once in a while, you can use this punctuation, especially in the test when you are not sure which Fanboys or transition to use. Rule number 3. You can connect two ICs with a semicolon, transition, and a comma. Here are some examples of transitions. However, therefore, for example, similarly, in addition, instead, likewise, thus, and then. Then requires an optional comma. Examples. John is very outgoing. For example, every weekend he spends with either his friends or family. We have two ICs, John is, and he spends, and we connect two ICs with a semicolon, transition, for example, and a comma. Let's look at some incorrect sentences. John has visited many places around the world, for example, France and Italy. The punctuation in this sentence is incorrect. You cannot use a semicolon before, for example, because the semicolon and a transition and a comma connect only two independent clauses. If you look at the part of the sentence after, for example, and comma, you will only find a phrase, France and Italy. France and Italy is not an independent clause. It's just a phrase. Therefore, the proper punctuation would be John has visited many places around the world, comma, for example, comma, France and Italy. And it's only a simple sentence because it has only one IC, one unit of subject and the verb. John has visited. If you want to make a compound sentence with transition, for example, you have to use two independent clauses. For example, John has visited many places around the world, semicolon, for example, comma, last summer he went to France and Italy. There are two common mistakes students can make when dealing with compound sentences punctuation. The first punctuation problem is called run-on, when you connect two ICs with no transitions or commas or semicolons or Fanboys. There's no punctuation at all. For example, I like reading and John enjoys traveling. Two independent clauses, I like reading, John enjoys traveling, are only connected with Fanboys and no punctuation. We call it a run-on. To correct this mistake, you simply need to put a comma after reading. He has been in many places. He enjoys traveling. Two independent clauses. He has been in many places, and he enjoys traveling. Two ICs are not connected with anything. And again, there are three ways you can punctuate this sentence correctly. One, follow rule number 1, which is a comma and Fanboys. Rule number 2, you can put a semicolon. And rule number 3, you can use a semicolon, a transition, and a comma. Let's look at some correct sentences. I like reading, comma, and John enjoys traveling. I like reading, semicolon, John enjoys traveling. Or you can make two simple sentences. I like reading, period. John enjoys traveling. Another common mistake is called comma splice, when two ICs are connected just with one comma. For example, John has visited many places around the world, comma, for example, comma, last summer he went to France and Italy. The sentence is incorrect because the transition, for example, requires a semicolon. Here are some correct sentences. John has visited many places around the world, semicolon, for example, comma, last summer he went to France and Italy. Or you can make two simple sentences. John has visited many places around the world, period. You can start the second sentence with a transition, for example, and you still have to put a comma, and finish. Last summer, he went to France and Italy. Before we go on, let's do a quick review. So far, we've learned about two types of clauses. An independent clause contains one unit of a subject and a verb. A dependent clause contains a subordinator and a subject and a verb. You can make a sentence with an independent clause, but you cannot make a sentence with just one dependent clause. We learned about the first type of sentences, which is a simple sentence. A simple sentence contains one independent clause, or one unit of a subject and a verb. A compound sentence contains at least two independent clauses, and we talked about three punctuation rules for compound sentences. You can connect two independent clauses with a comma and Fanboys. You can connect two independent clauses with just one semicolon, or you can connect two independent clauses with a semicolon, transition, and a comma. Now let's move on to the complex sentences. A complex sentence must have only one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. It can be more. And remember, our dependent clause is a subordinator plus IC. Here are some examples of subordinators. If, when, while, even though, although, who, what, which, that. Do not confuse subordinators with transitions from the compound sentence. Let's look at some examples of complex sentences. As soon as I finish reading, I will start writing. The first clause is our dependent clause. It has a subordinator as soon as and a subject and a verb unit, I finish. The second clause is an independent clause. It has subject and a verb, I will start. The formula is DC and IC. John enjoys traveling even though he's always out of money. The first clause is John enjoys traveling, is an independent clause. It has a subject and a verb, John enjoys. The second clause, even though he's always out of money, is a DC because it starts with the subordinator even though and has a subject and a verb, he is. The third sentence has one IC, John enjoys traveling, and two DCs, two independent clauses, even though he's always out of money, and when he comes back from a trip. There are only two punctuation rules in complex sentences. If you begin your sentence with an independent clause, there is no comma in between IC and DC. But if you begin a sentence with a dependent clause, you put a comma. You separate a dependent clause with a comma. DC, comma, IC. For example, I was 20 minutes late for school, although I left on time. No commas. Although I left on time, comma, I was 20 minutes late for school. Because you start with the dependent clause, although I left on time, you must put a comma before IC. Working with complex sentences, you have to be very careful. You have to avoid fragments. A fragment is a very common mistake. A fragment is a not finished sentence, meaning you only use a dependent clause and you put a period at the end of the dependent clause. And if you remember in earlier slides, we talked about making sentences, and we said that you cannot make a sentence with only just one DC. Here are some examples. It is incorrect to write "when I was little" and put a period at the end. You only used one DC, when, subordinator, I was, subject and the verb. To correct this sentence, you must add at least one IC. When I was little, comma, I wanted to be a pirate. Another example. When I was little and I wanted to be a pirate. Just because you put "and" between two clauses, it does not mean it's a complete sentence. You are still using only one dependent clause. You have one subordinator, when, and two independent clauses connected with "and." I was little and I wanted to be a pirate. But "when" belongs to two ICs, and it's still one dependent clause. Here is how you can correct this sentence. When I was little, comma, I wanted to be a pirate. Or, when I was little and I wanted to be a pirate, comma, my parents took me to Disney. Let's take a look at some more examples of fragments. Because there was a car accident. This sentence is not complete because there's no IC in this sentence. In order to finish this sentence and put a period, you have to add at least one IC. Because there was a car accident, comma, I had to wait for an hour. Let's look at another example. Because there was a car accident and I had to wait for an hour is also incorrect and a fragment because there's only one DC. Even though there is "and", it's still one DC. You have a subordinated because and two units of subject and the verb connected with "and". In order to make this sentence correct, you can either get rid of a comma and have just DCIC. For example, because there was a car accident, comma, I had to wait for an hour. Or you can have two subject-verb units in the DC and at the end finish it with IC. Because there was a car accident and I had to wait for an hour, comma, I came late. A compound complex sentence has to have at least two independent clauses and at least one dependent clause. Let's take a look at some examples. Berhan is from Turkey, but he speaks English well because he lived and studied in London. We have two ICs. Berhan is from Turkey. He speaks English well. And one DC with the subordinator because. The order of ICs and DCs will vary in compound complex sentences. It can be any order. Let's look at the second type, IC plus DC plus IC, where the dependent clause is in between two ICs. Maria has troubles with types of sentences, even though she studies hard, for she wants to pass the test. Sometimes a dependent clause can be inside an independent clause between the subject and the verb. For example, Berhan, who studied in London, is from Turkey, but he speaks English well. There are so many punctuation rules involved in a compound complex sentence, but these are the basic ones. If you connect two ICs, you follow the rules that are stated in a compound sentence. You connect two ICs in a compound complex sentence the same way you do it in a compound sentence. You connect two ICs either with a comma and Fanboys, or with the semicolon, or a semicolon and transition in a comma. For example, Barhan is from Turkey, comma, but he speaks English well. You connect IC and DC the same way as you do in a complex sentence, except for one rule. You put commas between IC and DC and between DC and IC. Barhan is from Turkey, but he speaks English well, comma, because he lived and studied in London. In a complex sentence, you do not put a comma after an independent clause. In a compound complex sentence, you do need to put a comma. Let us conclude what we've learned today. We talked about two types of clauses, independent clauses and dependent clauses. And you remember that you cannot make a sentence with just one dependent clause. If you do so, you create a fragment. There are four types of sentences. A simple sentence contains one independent clause. A compound sentence has to have at least two independent clauses. And there are three different ways to punctuate two ICs. A complex sentence has to have at least one DC and only one independent clause. And there are two ways to punctuate. If you begin a sentence with a dependent clause, you put a comma. If you begin a sentence with an independent clause, there is no comma. The trickiest one is the compound complex sentence. The compound complex sentence has to have at least two ICs and a minimum of one DC. And the punctuation is also not easy, and we said you look at the same punctuation rules when you're connecting two ICs, and you look at the same punctuation rules when you connect IC and DC in a complex sentence, except for one exception. You do put a comma after IC. And these are the common mistakes that students can make combining ICs and DCs. A run-on mistake is when you combine two ICs and put no punctuation. A comma splice when you connect two ICs with just one comma. And a fragment when you put a period at the end of DC with no IC in the sentence. Good luck.